Hey, I'm Nathan Cole. Surviving a national park seems easy to me. Stay on the trail and follow the signs. But I found 5 people who did the exact opposite. From a man in Yosemite who chased a squirrel who took his food off the trail, to a hiker in Zion who trusted his phone over a ranger standing right in front of him. It was June 25, 2018, in Yosemite National Park, California. Summer crowds filled the trails as visitors moved between overlooks and picnic areas. Beyond the marked paths, steep slopes of loose rock covered the mountainside. Among those tourists was 36-year-old Brecken Cole. Now, Brecken worked as a software engineer out in Phoenix, Arizona. So, personally, I picture him as a guy who spent most of his week glued to a desk. He loved weekend hikes and outdoor trips, but most of his experience came from well-maintained desert trails, not rugged mountain terrain. His friends always described him as smart, dependable, and fiercely competitive. On this specific trip, Brecken and his wife were celebrating 10 years of marriage. A 10th anniversary is a massive milestone, and they had spent months planning this dream vacation. His wife used to tease him about his stubborn streak playfully. See, if something irritated Brecken, he had this habit of turning it into a personal challenge that he had to solve right then and there, even if it didn't matter at all. And I'll be honest, I think a lot of us can relate to having that kind of stubborn pride. As morning turned into noon, the couple stopped beside the trail for a quick snack break. Brecken set an open bag of trail mix down on a flat rock while he snapped some pictures of the scenery. Now, Yosemite rangers warn you constantly not to leave food unattended because the squirrels there will straight up rob you. But personally, I think a lot of tourists completely underestimate just how bold and fearless these little animals actually are. Within seconds, a squirrel rushed over and started pulling food right out of the bag. A few nearby hikers laughed as the animal darted away with its prize. But for Brecken, the laughter made him feel exposed. He immediately chased after it. Other visitors told him it was no big deal and not worth worrying about, and his wife begged him to just leave it alone and get back on the trail. Instead, embarrassed by the attention and totally annoyed that a rodent had just punked him, Brecken followed the squirrel farther and farther away from the marked path. The animal disappeared among the rocks near a steep, unstable slope of loose stone. The ground got incredibly sketchy. Small stones shifted right beneath his shoes, and larger rocks wobbled under his weight, which would have terrified me. But he kept pushing toward the spot where he last saw the squirrel. Several yards onto the slope, Brecken stepped onto a bad section of loose rock. Witnesses later told investigators that they saw his right leg suddenly sink deep into the shifting stones. He tried to pull himself free and regain his balance, but that one movement triggered a terrifying chain reaction. The rocks began to slide, and his body twisted sideways as the slope beneath him completely collapsed. Brecken fell hard. Hikers watched in absolute horror as he tumbled down the steep slope, repeatedly striking exposed boulders. His head hit a massive rock first, followed by his chest and shoulder, with a wave of loose stones chasing him downhill. By the time he finally stopped, he had fallen dozens of feet and was lying completely motionless among the scattered rocks below. Emergency services were called immediately. Rangers and rescue crews arrived within minutes, but Brecken's injuries were catastrophic, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner determined that multiple blunt force injuries from the fall, including severe head and chest trauma, were not survivable. The death was ruled accidental. Park officials later used the case in safety briefings to remind visitors to stay on marked trails and avoid chasing wildlife. A brief moment of frustration led to a fatal decision on terrain he did not understand. Brecken never imagined a squirrel in a bag of trail mix would be the last thing he ever chased. And for me, the next story proves that the same thing, wanting one perfect shot, can be just as deadly. It was September 18, 2022, in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. Visitors lined the roads watching wildlife in the open meadows, while rangers reminded them to keep a safe distance from the animals. Right in the middle of all those tourists was 40-year-old Caspian Moores. Caspian worked in real estate down in Colorado and had recently gotten really into travel photography. He wasn't some famous influencer, but he loved sharing his trips on social media. But over time, and I think a lot of us are guilty of this, he became hyper-focused on capturing that one image, the kind of shot that would stand out from the thousands of identical vacation photos people scroll past every single day. For his milestone 40th birthday, Caspian and his wife Melissa finally took that big Yellowstone trip they've been talking about for years. His friends always described him as outgoing, super competitive, and incredibly determined. To be honest, he was the type of guy who always pushed himself just a little bit further than he probably should have. This vacation was supposed to celebrate a big moment in his life. And me, personally, I get why he wanted something special. He wanted photos that felt grand enough to remember forever. On the third afternoon of their trip, traffic slowed to a crawl along a park road after visitors spotted a grizzly bear feeding out in a meadow several hundred feet away. Dozens of people gathered along the dirt shoulder to watch, most staying right by their vehicles while snapping pictures. Caspian joined right in and spent several minutes photographing the bear. But when he stopped to review the images on his phone, the bear just looked tiny and distant. And according to Melissa, Caspian wanted something way more dramatic. Personally, I think he was chasing that algorithm high. He wanted a photo that looked so close, it would make people instantly stop scrolling. Just then, a nearby ranger reminded the crowd to maintain the required distance from the bears, warning everyone that these animals can react unpredictably if they feel crowded. Caspian actually stepped back at first when the ranger walked by, but as soon as the ranger moved farther down the viewing area, he started walking right out into the meadow. Several tourists noticed and literally yelled at him to stop. One photographer even pointed out that people get mauled every single year because they get too close to the wildlife. But for some reason, Caspian just ignored them. The bear stayed focused on eating, and I think each successful step Caspian took just convinced him that the next one would be safe too. When Caspian finally stopped, he had moved far beyond the main viewing area and well inside the recommended safety zone. And then the bear suddenly lifted its head and looked directly at him. Melissa screamed for him to come back. Instead, Caspian raised his phone and started recording a video. The bear stood upright for just a second, then dropped to all fours and charged. Witness footage actually showed Caspian standing completely still for a moment. And to me, it looked like he was just confused rather than alarmed. His brain couldn't process the danger. The bear traveled the distance between them in seconds. So, by the time Caspian finally turned to run, the bear was already on him, slamming him violently into the grass. The attack unfolded in full view of dozens of horrified tourists. The bear bit into Caspian's upper body and neck, tossing him across the meadow before running off. Rangers and paramedics arrived within about 6 minutes. Responders found Caspian unconscious, with absolutely catastrophic injuries. When I looked at the medical details, it was just horrific, severe trauma to his head, neck, and chest caused massive, rapid blood loss. Despite emergency treatment right there on the grass, he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Investigators later recovered his phone, and personally, I find it heartbreaking that his final images and video clearly documented his gradual, step-by-step approach toward the bear. The coroner's report concluded that Caspian died from multiple traumatic injuries caused by a grizzly bear attack. The damage to his vital organs and major arteries was just too severe for any human to survive. The park's official investigation determined that the bear was just behaving like a normal wild animal, and that Caspian had deliberately moved closer despite explicit warnings from park staff and everyday tourists. The bear was never hunted down because officials ruled it had simply reacted to a human approaching too closely. For me, this whole case is just a brutal reminder of why those wildlife safety rules exist. I still can't shake the image of Caspian's own camera capturing his final steps toward that bear. And what gets me about the next story is that this time, it wasn't just one person whose ego led them past the warning signs. It was October 11th, 2016, at Grand Canyon National Park's South Rim in Arizona. As evening approached, tourists gathered at the overlooks while rangers monitored the trails under clear skies. But right in the middle of that crowd were 28-year-old Gail Robinson and 31-year-old Brian Green. Gail ran a small travel channel focused on outdoor spots. He edited videos for local businesses just to get by, and personally, I can totally relate to this. He spent nearly every spare dollar trying to make his channel blow up. His friends said he was energetic, ambitious, and always hunting for unique footage. Then you had Brian, who was chasing the exact same dream. He was a freelance photographer whose online growth had been painfully slow. If you've ever tried to build something online, you know how soul-crushing that can be. And for me, it's easy to see how he fell into a bad headspace. Brian was constantly tracking other creators' numbers, and over time, he'd actually developed this quiet, bitter social media rivalry with Gail. They were always trying to prove who could make the better content. That night, both of them ended up at a travel media meetup right around the main overlook. As sunset got closer, Gail started complaining that everyone was capturing the exact same boring footage. Brian agreed, but what frustrates me is that they immediately started debating who could find the most extreme angle before the sun went down. Now, just a short distance away, there were several warning signs advising people to stay on the marked trails because the ground near the rim is incredibly unstable. But neither Gail nor Brian paid attention. Personally, I think they had total tunnel vision. They were completely fixated on getting their shots. Pretty soon, they walked away from the crowd and stepped onto an unofficial rocky ledge way past the safety area. Other tourists noticed them getting way too close to the edge, and one person even yelled out a warning. But you know how ego works. Witnesses said both men just laughed it off and kept recording. Neither one wanted to back down and lose this unspoken competition. As the sun dipped lower, Gale started filming a wide-angle shot while walking backward, his eyes glued to his camera screen. Brian was standing just a few feet away, totally wrapped up in his own footage. When I think about this moment, it honestly makes my stomach turn. Neither man was looking at the actual ground. Without warning, Gale stepped onto loose gravel right at the edge. His feet shot out from under him, and his body went backward. Tourists heard him scream as he started sliding toward the drop. Brian lunged forward and managed to grab Gale's forearm right before he went over. For a few agonizing seconds, Brian actually held onto him. Witnesses described a violent, terrifying struggle as loose stones kept breaking free. Gale's weight pulled Brian closer and closer to the edge. Brian tried to brace himself. The ground shifted again, and both men slid forward together. It's hard for me to even imagine the horror of the crowd as they watched both of them disappear over the rim in an instant, because darkness and the steep terrain made a nighttime recovery too dangerous. Rescue teams secured the area and waited until first light to descend. Recovery teams reached the area the next morning. Investigators later recovered the cameras, and the footage showed both men focused on their screens rather than the ground around them. The medical examiner found that both died within minutes from massive blunt force injuries caused by the fall. What stays with me is that the cameras captured exactly how it happened. For a few seconds, their attention shifted from the cliff to getting the perfect shot. And watching that footage of two grown men staring at their screens instead of the ground beneath them really got to me. And this next story shows how a sibling rivalry can turn just as fatal. If you think these are some of the dumbest ways people have lost their lives in national parks, wait until you hear the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. It was August 18th, 2021. A gray afternoon hung over the coastal mudflats near Olympic National Park in Washington. The tide was far out, exposing wide stretches of wet sand and mud. Small groups of visitors walked the shoreline, while seabirds moved across the flat. The weather seemed calm and ordinary. Out beyond that safe shoreline, 32-year-old John James Keller was walking around. Now, from what I gathered about James, he had spent pretty much his entire adult life trying to stay one step ahead of his younger brother, Roran. James was a fiercely competitive sales manager, and personally, I'd just call him stubborn. Roran, a videographer, had that same competitive streak. Their family gatherings usually turned into these harmless little contests that neither brother ever wanted to lose. Well, that afternoon, the brothers were exploring a remote tidal area notorious for dangerous mudflats. Warning signs were posted everywhere explaining that the deep mud could trap you and that the incoming tides had actually killed people, but the brothers just blew off the warning. And this is where things took a turn that personally makes my stomach drop. Their little debate turned into a dare. Both of them stepped right past the warning signs and started walking across the mudflats, filming it on their phones. At first, the ground felt totally solid. They were laughing and pushing farther out. About 15 minutes later, James dropped knee-deep into the muck. Roran just laughed and started recording. James tried to yank his leg free, but as I'm sure you can picture, that only drove his other leg even deeper. Within minutes, the mud swallowed him past his thighs. Bystanders begged them to call 911. Personally, it looks like neither brother wanted to swallow their pride and admit this was a real emergency. For nearly an hour, Roran tried everything, yanking James's arms and digging with his bare hands, but honestly, it was completely useless. The mud created a terrifying suction, holding tighter the more they struggled. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, and I can only imagine the panic setting in as the tide was slowly creeping back. A tourist finally called called for help. Responders were sent immediately, but reaching them took forever because James was trapped several hundred yards from solid ground. And thinking about how much time was wasted before that call was finally made is ridiculous. By the time rescue crews arrived, shallow water was already pooling around James. Rescuers carefully deployed specialized mud rescue equipment, including inflatable paths and safety lines to avoid becoming trapped themselves. Once they reached him, rescuers secured harnesses around his upper body and attempted to free his legs using water jets and rescue tools designed to break the suction around buried limbs. But the mud extended far deeper than anyone initially realized. Every attempt to free him took precious time, and the incoming tide kept rising. I've heard about the body camera footage from that night, and honestly, it sounds like a living nightmare. It shows rescuers working continuously for more than an hour while the water rises from around James's knees to his waist and eventually to his chest. The situation fell apart fast. The incoming seawater made it impossible to keep digging, and James was freezing and exhausted. Soon, the rescuers faced a terrifying reality. They were about to get trapped and drown themselves. Supervisors had to make the brutal call and order the crew to retreat. James stayed stuck as the ocean completely covered him. Recovery teams found James's body later that night. What stands out in the investigation is the timeline. Nearly an hour passed between the moment he became trapped and the moment anyone called for help. Investigators concluded that an earlier emergency call would likely have given rescuers enough time to reach him before conditions became fatal. The death was ruled accidental. Following the incident, park officials renewed warnings about reporting emergencies immediately, even when people believe they can solve the problem themselves. The case was later referenced in visitor safety materials as an example of how delaying a rescue request can quickly turn a survivable situation into a fatal one. It's devastating to think about. A delay driven largely by pride and embarrassment ended up costing James his life. The next story is almost harder to watch because this time it was a phone screen, not pride, that someone trusted with his life. It was September 1st, 2012, in Zion National Park, Utah. Hikers moved through the visitor area collecting maps and water, while park staff monitored forecasts for thunderstorms expected later that day. Among those hikers was 38-year-old Sebastian Avery. 38-year-old Sebastian Avery was a tech sales manager known for finding the absolute fastest route to everything, whether it was a work project or a hiking trail. Personally, I think we all know someone just like that. He and his wife Emily were on vacation in Zion National Park. Emily usually planned their trips and checked the weather, but Sebastian relied almost entirely on technology. He trusted navigation apps with his life. Honestly, it's a habit a lot of us are guilty of. That morning, a park ranger told them a popular slot canyon route was closed due to expected thunderstorms. But to me, it's so frustrating to see what Sebastian did next. He checked his phone, saw the app still listed the route as open, and assumed the ranger's info was just outdated. They kept hiking and passed a physical closure sign. Sebastian stepped right around it. Farther down the trail, they hit another warning sign about flash floods. If I were Emily, I would have been losing my mind here, and she did beg him to turn back. But Sebastian pointed to his screen, arguing that thousands of people trust this app every day. By afternoon, the canyon walls narrowed and thunder echoed nearby. Because the sky directly overhead was still clear, Sebastian assumed the warnings were exaggerated. In my opinion, he just used this to validate his own bias. They pushed deeper inside. Shortly after 3 o'clock, a thin stream on the canyon floor instantly turned into a rushing torrent of thick, muddy water, rocks, and debris. They managed to scramble onto a narrow ledge a few feet up. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been, just trapped there while the flood roared right below them. They stayed on the ledge for nearly 2 hours while floodwater rushed through the canyon. Eventually, the current slowed, and much of the canyon floor became visible again. Emily wanted to wait for help, but Sebastian believed the danger had passed. After climbing down, they carefully continued through the canyon. Minutes later, Sebastian slipped on mud-covered sandstone, falling hard and breaking his leg while suffering a head injury. It is very disturbing to think he was completely immobilized. Emily tried calling 911 but had no signal. As daylight faded, she moved between Sebastian and a higher rock shelf, searching for a way out, but he couldn't climb. Hours later, a second flood surge roared into the canyon. Emily scrambled back onto the elevated shelf, but Sebastian could barely move. Because of his injuries, he was overtaken by the water. Emily survived the night and was rescued the next morning. Rescuers found Sebastian's body downstream. The medical examiner confirmed he drowned after being trapped by the second flood, When I look at the park's investigation, the facts are incredibly clear. The canyon was closed the day before, warnings were posted everywhere, and rangers were on high alert. What really stays with me is what the investigators stated at the end. If they had just stayed on that ledge and waited, both would have lived.